Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have a fantastic and incredible episode for you guys. So hopefully you enjoy. And today is going to be an episode where all the topics are Cognitive Elite questions because people asked questions that I was going to have as a primary topic today, but they were asked in Cognitive Elite questions. So everything is going to be a Cognitive Elite question. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the TikTok ban. And we got a question from K-Max asking for my thoughts on that. So I'll give my pitch right now. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highly-respected.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. And he was just wondering, he's worried that this could spill over to Rumble and Elon Musk's Twitter. He's not liking all the lobbies that are lining up behind a TikTok ban, a lot of it due to the information surrounding Israel, and it's apparently supporting pro-Palestine. And he asked for my thoughts on the TikTok ban. Generally, TikTok I'm not the biggest fan of, but when we talk about any problems associated with TikTok, I think the one thing we have to take back is that these problems are present and prevalent all throughout the internet and social media. And there has been a unique effort for years, at least 4 years or 5 years, ever since TikTok got big, to paint TikTok as the main villain of big tech, as the main villain of social media. And now, why is that? Now, a lot of that has been due to the fact that it's Chinese operated. That's an understandable reason to have some suspicion of it. And I'm not one of those people who's like pro-China or thinks that China's based. So there is an understandable reason for our most popular social media app being owned by the Chinese. So that's one thing. But another thing that's never really stated in there, it's one of the few platforms that is not operated by one of the big tech giants because it's Chinese owned and operated. And they have not liked this competition outside of their purview, outside of their sphere. And they've always wanted to build up an alternative to TikTok, which has not really succeeded so far, or to gain control of TikTok, which is what this bill in the House is set to do. The House bill forces ByteDance, which is the parent company, to divest of TikTok, meaning it has to sell off TikTok to a American company, or it's just banned from America. So that's its options. Now, if you look at the tech companies that can actually operate, who have the backbone and the structure to operate such a large tech platform, there aren't that many that can do so. And the two top ones that can do so are Google and Microsoft. Facebook, or Meta, was one of the few companies, one of the main companies that was pushing for a TikTok ban and was looking to acquire TikTok, but it's not as interested anymore. I think it's through, they're trying to do some TikTok formation with Instagram, our rival through Instagram, and it's not as interested in acquiring it anymore. But they're another company that has the structure to actually overtake it because this is a giant platform. Rumble has been suggested, but Rumble doesn't have the infrastructure to take over such a massive, massive platform as TikTok. So that's who's really pushing this. And it's also the Pentagon, the military industrial complex, because they don't like China involved. So those are the two, big reasons that is. It's China owned, and big tech doesn't like the competition from outside its sphere, and it wants it to be controlled by big tech. And it's wanting to ban TikTok has been very popular among Republicans for a while. Because they've all, obviously most Republicans are anti-China. I don't think that that's a bad thing, but I just think it's, if this is CCP owned, they're against it. And sometimes this has been dumb stuff, like the one time the NBA was not letting its players and coaches say free Hong Kong, which it's like, who gives a shit about that? That was all the way back in 2019 and elsewhere. And then conservatives began showing up in free Hong Kong shirts at NBA games, which really owning the NBA by buying tickets to their games to show off a stupid shirt. And they've always been very invested in building up a shared enemy or a common enemy in China, or really just the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, because they never just say China. They always say CCP or Chi-Coms, usually CCP. And there's a lot of interest in it because there's a lot of Chinese dissidents who are passing money around, like the Falun Gong, which own Epoch Times, Miles Guo, who is a main backer of Steve Bannon and some other people. And so there's a lot of that money and interest that is playing into that. And if you've ever been to, they haven't had many large right-wing protests in a while or demonstrations, but I've ever went to one, like, I remember the early Stop the Steal ones in like November. Like the first one, it was supposed to be the Million MAGA March. And there were a ton of like random Chinese people there with like down with CCP stuff. And I don't even remember watching clips of other rallies and stuff and demonstrations. And those people are always there. I don't know where they come from, but they're there at all protests and demonstrations, showing that a lot of Chinese dissident movement, our money is going into conservatism at the moment. And so they're very much opposed to TikTok and the CCP's interests. And for those who don't know, it's like in November. They may think November 2023. No, November 2020, right after the election, where there was a big Million MAGA March, and there was all these Chinese there. And I even remember in DC events before that, when I go to anything that was like vaguely conservative, you would see the Chinese there and like down with CCP signs. It was very odd. It was like, I never really quite understood it, but they were there ready to protest. But that aside, is that the right is very eager to turn the CCP into the new Soviet Union, is that it's a shared enemy for the right. It's a unifying cause for the right, because the right has had really struggled to find a unifying cause ever since the Cold War ended. You know, the modern conservatism, American conservatism, developed as a strong anti-communist force, is that it felt that liberals were not sufficiently anti-communist, and they were going to create a new movement that was going to be fully anti-communist and anti-socialist, and this was going to be the defining feature, the uniting trait of the American right. Ever since the Cold War ended, it's not really had a unifying trait. And they've struggled to keep everyone together. The real unifying trait is just opposition to liberals. And owning the libs has become more common for the right ever since the 90s, even with Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, those type of figures emerging and gaining more prominence in the 90s. That's been a real key to it. And that's why they're really motivated by, rather than so much principles, but trying to own certain figures that they hate, whether it's Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Obama. This has really been the motivating framework for the right, rather than a shared sense of principles or ideas. It's just that we don't really like the Democrats and the liberals, and we want to create policies that own them, which, you know, it's common in politics for this. I mean, the American Whigs formed as opposition to Andrew Jackson, and that was their shared unifying framework, which became a problem in the 1840s, but that's beyond this podcast. So we'll keep it in the modern era. And that's really what it's been for the right. But they don't think that this is as strong of a motivating force as opposition to communism. And they do want something that can tie in the American right into the larger foreign policy objectives of the American regime, the American empire. And what better way of doing that than making the CCP as the source of all of America's woes? Because this is a funny thing, is that the right wants to imagine that TikTok has somehow invented all these social maladies that we've had for years and years, but apparently it's all due to TikTok. And they go from the frivolous and funny. The funniest is that all these young women or young girls are feeling self-aware and self-conscious and having low self-esteem because of TikTok. And this is always the funny stuff about social media, when the right wants to go after the social media companies. They're like, you're making young women feel bad about themselves. They think that they're not attractive enough They're not good enough. How dare you, Facebook? How dare you, TikTok? You know, they've even used this against Instagram and others. And this is the biggest bullshit I've ever heard. It's like, I don't think there's a group of women, a demographic group that is lacking in self-awareness or self-confidence and self-esteem than young women. Literally, we live in a society that gasses them up 24/7. And if you're an attractive woman, you are not faced with real like depression and low self-esteem because you have the world at your fingertips. Like, the world is your oyster, especially in modern America. Like, you can do whatever you want. People will pay for it. People will, like, you know, you're going to have millions of simps no matter what. And we have, you know, even conservative movement is built up on gassing up its own, the women involved in it because, I mean, it's all these like old guys will just see all these young women that can't find a good man. This is terrible. Oh no, they're seeing an Instagram video that's making them feel insufficient and body dysmorphia. And it's like they're saying like there's so much body dysmorphia among young women. It's like, you know, have you seen like the whales that are a lot of young women right now? I don't think they're suffering enough body dysmorphia. If they had all this like concern about their body, you'd think that there'd be you know, a real fight against obesity in this country. And sadly, if these women are feeling body dysmorphia, they're not doing anything about it. Maybe they're just feeling bad about it. But no, the social concerns about all these young women, they're feeling bad about themselves. They're alone. They're so lonely. It really they never talk about like the effects of that's happening on young teenage males and young men, which is like far worse problems. I mean, you can even see the rates of incels that's growing. It's like way lopsided in the male favor. And that's generally a sign, I mean, you know, some obviously could be Volcel or whatever, but it's often a sign that these guys aren't getting dates. They're not getting any relationships. They have fewer friends than women. And with the women problems, it's just that, you know, we have a whole society based on gassing them up and you know, throwing ourselves at their feet to ensure that their self-esteem is protected at all times. And it's like young men are just like having zero purpose, having no friends, no relationship prospects, a lot of no career prospects because a lot of them are falling behind in general. You know, young white males, I mean, are the demographic that is most falling behind in this country, or at least when it comes to university admissions. We're not going to go into the topic of whether of going to college or not, but that's just a sign that there's a real problem among young men and what's happening to them on a mental state. But none of that concerns like the mainstream media, news, or pundits. They're all obsessed with like the body dysmorphia promoted by TikTok and Instagram to young women, which, you know, you would think that there'd be a lot of young women ensuring that they're not obese, but it's the opposite. I guess it's just encouraging them to eat more cake and ice cream and feel that that's good enough for them. So I've always found that the most ridiculous thing ever when I hear that. It's like there's no group of people that has less to worry about, you know, negative attitudes and depression than young women. I mean, maybe if they're unattractive, maybe they do have problems, but and they're not getting all the swipes that they think are due to them on the dating apps. But for attractive young women, you know, they have any problems. But as a society, we have to be built around this. And I guess they find that that's more of a useful cudgel against social media than worrying about the incels who, you know, and everyone hates incels in our society. Unfortunately, you know, I try to stand up for the incels because everyone else pushes them down. But for the rest of society, it's like, you know, if we had like Bukele-style prison camps for a group of people, it would be directed against incels, not against criminals. Outside of that, there's other, you know, dumb reasons that they say. It's primarily that leftism, or Zoomers are so left-wing solely because of TikTok, and that they're getting these ideas that, oh, maybe they shouldn't support Israel, or, you know, that they're getting into Black Lives Matter because of the Chinese and all these other things, which is just downright stupid. And I'll start on the Israel thing and then go to the other things that conservatives complain about. You know, if you go to any social media format, it's not like pro-Israel stuff is really resonating with young people. You can go on Twitter, or X as it's now known, and you'll see the anti-Israel stuff overwhelmingly is overshadows the pro-Israel stuff, especially from young people, especially from young content creators. And you see some, you know, really, you see a lot of stuff you would never, and claims you would never hear on mainstream media or CNN, and it's overwhelmingly anti-Israel. Even if for the mainstream media from at least in CNN and MSNBC are remarkably more critical and skeptical of Israel than they would have been 10 or 20 years ago. Way more. I remember watching clips from, you know, past conflicts with Israel, and it's overwhelmingly in favor of Israel. Now they have a lot of guys who are going on there and like they're talking about the war crimes that Israel's committing, and they're talking about, you know, that they're maybe doing ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and this seems to be a point of view that they're willing to express on those cable networks. Maybe that's the Chi-Coms behind it, I guess, with conservatives. And so it's not really TikTok's fault. It's just society in general is moving in a more skeptical attitude towards Israel. This is apparent on all social media platforms. I don't know if people really don't do politics on Instagram, but if people were doing politics on Instagram, it'd be overwhelmingly favor of Palestine versus Israel. And even with like models and stuff and others that are big on Instagram, you know, they're generally more pro-Palestine than they are pro-Israel. So I want to find where the pro-Israel stuff is. Maybe Facebook because of the boomers, or Fox News. But it's certainly not on X, and it's certainly not on probably on Instagram. So, and it's not even really on YouTube either. So it's just blaming TikTok for a social change that it's not driving. It's just the fact that a lot of young people have no desire to be in favor of Israel. Israel, you know, Israel's tried, you know, with their social media team, but you can even see there's weird ass stuff that they post on X, like the one thing about retrieving the sperm from dead soldiers, and you know, they've posted some superhero stuff, or they posted the villain stuff, which was like, you know, Voldemort being revolted by Hamas, and it's just like very weird and very you know, tone that doesn't really resonate with people, and it's obviously not going to win over Zoomers. But they're just wanting to blame TikTok. And it's also like the Osama bin Laden viral clips, that they were clearly using that to, you know, really shut down TikTok with saying, oh, these guys are sharing this Osama bin Laden clip. It's like, this is turning the youth into pro bin Laden, which, you know, I think it was overstated in some ways, and you can find equally odd stuff on X, to say the least, and viral content in support of dead leaders that you would not, that America doesn't like. You can find that stuff all the time on X, but I don't think that's a reason for censorship. And so they're really trying to blame that this Chi-Coms are not allowing this. The funniest is that like Chi-Coms are not allowing content about the Tiananmen Square massacre and the Uyghurs. It's like, who the fuck wants to see that content as a Zoomer? It's like, it's all apolitical content. They want to watch dance videos and like all their goofy stuff. They don't want to have a propaganda video about the Tiananmen Square massacre, and especially not the Uyghurs. Like, this stuff doesn't go viral on any other social media platform. You have to go to the cable news networks where they, you know, have a captive audience, and they're just like, we're going to talk about the Uyghurs. But even that stuff doesn't really, it doesn't resonate with the American public. And it's like, I don't care. Like, you can find this information and content anywhere else throughout the internet. TikTok is not like the place that you're going to put it up. You know, it's not like you have Imagine, like their top content creators, or it's like doing a Tiananmen Square dance or something. You know, they don't, it's not what the Zoomers actually want to watch. It's not popular content on any other social media platform. It's like, who cares? But even just like the leftism in general, they're wanting to blame TikTok for this, which is also just reflective of broader social changes. But it's easier to blame the Chinese, the CCP for these than to admit the truth that this is all coming from internal. And they've been using this line ever since the Black Lives Matter riots, the George Floyd revolution of 2020, which like people like Steve Bannon and others were trying to say that this is a Chi-Com plot, that Chinese were responsible for this. And it's like, no, they weren't. And also, like our whole, the whole regime endorsed this, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the FBI, the, most Democratic politicians, Mitt Romney. It's like, if you want to see who backed this, look at our own leaders. Look at our own institutions. The FBI and the Pentagon had more of a role in the BLM riots than the Chinese. The Chinese had no role in it. The Chinese didn't even understand that the left doesn't like the phrase "all lives matter," which they had a propaganda video and it's like "all lives matter." It's like, you guys clearly don't understand what they're writing about and don't really understand their messaging at all. It's a good thing for America. I mean, if Chinese figured out leftism and how to deploy it, we would not be in a good situation. But they don't. They don't understand this stuff. That's why they did an All Lives Matter video after Floyd, showing that they had really no role in this. It came from internal. And they're not the ones that are imposing DEI in schools and businesses. That's American administrators and American companies that are imposing these ideas. They're not the ones sending amicus briefs to the Supreme Court defending affirmative action. That's American companies. And the Pentagon, the Pentagon's insisting that the military academies must have diversity. It's a national security imperative. It makes us a more effective fighting force. That's not the Chi-Coms. That's our own military generals. So it's like, it's just wanting to blame a foreign power for these problems we have that are internal and that are articulated by our own leaders and by our own institutions. Even if you want to go to the university problem. They're also worked about Confucius Institutes. It's like the Confucius Institutes, I'm fine with banning them, but they're not the ones responsible for teaching white privilege, for hiring Ibram X. Kendi and making that required reading in schools. They're not the ones like insisting they've got to have racial quotas. They're not the ones that are embracing anti-whiteness in general. They're not responsible for that. This is all coming from internal. And so it just makes it easier for the right to imagine this is a foreign invasion. This is foreign subversion of ourselves, of the Chinese. And that's not to, defend, I don't have a problem with getting rid of Confucius Institutes. I always think that we should restrict more Chinese immigration, which they choose not to. All these people are like, we need to ban TikTok, aren't focusing on restricting Chinese immigration, which is a bigger problem because all these Chinese come over, they get, sensitive jobs, and they began sending information back to China. There's several cases of this. And they're all pretty much required to give up this information as a part of Chinese laws. If you're a Chinese citizen, you're required to cooperate with their intelligence agencies. It's by law. So that's a bigger problem, but they don't focus on that. They just focus on TikTok. Which, in going along with this, like this is an internal problem, it's like the two companies that are most likely to take over TikTok if it divests are Google and Microsoft. And Google is far worse than the Chinese in promoting wokeness. They've restricted and censored several YouTube videos that, whether it's on COVID, vaccine, BLM, the 2020 elections, they all censor that. And their algorithm ensures you only read left-wing media, that you never get in contact with conservative media, or you never hear forbidden truths when you type in stuff to Google. That doesn't happen on TikTok. It's like, oh, well, I can't find a Tiananmen Square video. Well, guess what? You can't find out the truth about George Floyd by typing it into Google. You're going to get only the information that they want to curate and want you to see. And they're also very anti-Trump. They're clearly not going to try to rig the algorithms against Trump. If Google or Microsoft got a control of the TikTok algorithm, they would clearly use it to favor Biden and to attack Trump with that and to make people more likely to vote against Trump in the upcoming elections. I don't think the CCP is that really is going to rig the algorithm in the same way that Google and Microsoft will. And Microsoft's also very left-wing. I mean, Bill Gates. I mean, Bill Gates is like second in enemies list to like Klaus Schwab. Like the whole right hates Bill Gates, and then they're like, let's have Bill Gates in control of the most popular, social media platform for young Americans. How does that make sense? And Microsoft's been involved in a lot of these other things. They have like fact checker groups like NewsGuard and others that are incentivized to go after conservative media and right-wing opinions and to fact check them and say they're wrong when they're in fact not, and to deplatform them and rig algorithms against right-wing content. Google, those are like probably the two worst tech companies. They're even worse than Meta. They're definitely worse than X now, and those are what's going to be in charge of TikTok. And I think that one thing is that they could make TikTok far more political. I've argued this a lot, is that TikTok is a rather apolitical platform, especially compared to X or compared to Facebook circa 2019. It's probably less political, or it's probably a little bit more political than Instagram, but compared to what millennials were using in the 2010s, it's less political. And most of the content that people have, it's just non-political content. Like the dance videos and stuff that have nothing to do with, and the other goofy videos and other meme stuff has nothing to do with politics. And there's some like stupid political content on there. I know people are like, well, there's a political video I saw, but that's not what the majority of the platform is. And that's I think it's better for young Americans to be depoliticized than hyper-politicized, because if they were hyper-politicized, we'd have the moment like we did in the late 2010s with this like massive Trump hysteria, massive support for Antifa, massive support for other left-wing causes, and everyone posting black squares and stuff after George Floyd. It is better for these guys to just not think about politics. Now you may say like, we need to wake the youth up. We need to wake up some of the youth, but I think most of the youth, when you look at the demographics, when you look at how left-wing young women are, it's better if they're just focused on dance videos rather than getting into politics. Because if they're going to get into politics, it's much more likely that they get into leftism and they're used as a force to push for this. And it's better for us now to not have a hyper-politicized moment like we did in the late 2010s and extending into 2021. Trump is likely to win in November, and the Democrats and the left are not energizing their base. They're too focused on sports betting and TikTok to do this. I think if you ban TikTok or you put it in charge of another company, you could easily see them rigging the algorithms to make the Zoomers much more political. Not political in the way we want, but political in the way that they're most likely to be, and that's very left-wing, and that's not a good sign for the right. And so that's one thing I've always said about TikTok, that I don't find it. I find it very stupid. Obviously, you'd wish that this was not the prevailing norm of our society. It's having a bad effect on attention spans and other things. But it's like that with the entire internet. The internet itself is, anything that you could say bad about TikTok applies to the entire internet, applies to the entire social media. And everyone on X who's complaining about TikTok or using those same criticisms against TikTok can say about the same thing about X, except it's just more political. But I don't even know if the political information that's getting out there is particularly useful or worthwhile to know on X for the majority of the population. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So with the TikTok ban, I'm generally very skeptical of it. In a social framework, yeah, you would not want that. But if it's not there, you're just going to have an alternative to that, because that's what the public wants. The public wants those short videos that they scroll through that are, that's filled with the idiocy and other things of that. And if you put that in charge of a big tech company like Google or Microsoft, they are going to use that to rig the algorithm even more than the Chinese are. And they're going to ensure that a lot of content that maybe get out there on TikTok, like the truth about George Floyd, the truth about Black Lives Matter, and other such causes and information, are not seen, and instead they're guided towards voting for Biden and seeing Trump as the Antichrist and as the new Hitler. And I think that's why it deserves a lot more skepticism for this. I mean, Trump is, Trump, it's kind of dictated by his pettiness against Meta, warranted pettiness because they did ban him. But, he's right. You have more to worry about our own companies getting control of these platforms than you do with the Chinese. I don't really see China as really living up to this reputation that we want as the great enemy. Even compared to the Soviet Union in the 80s, the American public, they don't like China, but it doesn't rise to the level of the great enemy like the Soviet Union. And it very much feels like it's top down. They're trying to get us to really feel that the Chinese are as bad as the Soviet Union. I mean, this is a little bit of a digression, but I have to go into this. With China isn't exporting an ideology. It's no longer really communist. It's just about its own power and interests and its own economic interests when it goes around the world. I mean, the difference when it's pitching itself to other parts of the world is like, we're not going to interfere in your government. We're not going to interfere in the way you run your things. We don't give a shit if you're a dictatorship or what. Here's some money and some grants. We just expect like payment on this and our interests respected. And we get an influence in your country. While when America goes around, it's like, we're going to change your government. We're going to interfere the way you govern business. We're going to make sure you don't pass certain laws or get really mad about that. And a lot of the third world prefers China now because they just give money, no strings attached. Well, no strings attached in terms of the form of government and how they govern and how they run their lives. And a lot of countries prefer that better. But that's not really like spreading communism. And even the Soviet Union was still doing this. And it was still seen as a huge threat to American interests, even into the 80s when it was on its last legs. China doesn't really amount to that. And it doesn't really have the type of power of a hold of the American public. And even with average conservatives, they generally hate libs more than they hate Chinese. Which I would say in the 80s, they definitely hated the communists more than they hated the libs. And throughout the Cold War, the communists were it. And they had to, even with like domestic enemies, they had to say that they're on the same team as the communists. This is very apparent in the 50s and 60s. When they wanted to make a point against their opposition, they said they're a communist, which actually meant something. Today, if you say communist, it's like an anachronism. It doesn't really connect with people. It just sounds kind of stupid. Fascist has more resonance with the public than communist does, which we can argue how stupid that is, but that's just the way it is. When people hear fascist, they hear bad, authoritarian, they're wanting to take away my rights. When they hear communist, they think you're almost talking about the monarchy or something. It's something well in the past. Even though communism has much more connection to the present than fascism, it's just the way that our public operates and how media has influenced people's perceptions of things. So it doesn't really connect. I mean, the right's trying to make communists a new thing in the way that they did in the Cold War, but it's just not going to work. And it's why the CCP doesn't quite amount to the grand enemy that the Soviet Union did. And there are problems with this when it's used to support woke American corporations like Google and Microsoft, and to have them have more control over social media and the tech and the internet. That's not good. I don't think anybody should support that. And it also creates more support for the regime and the deep state and the military-industrial complex, which people should be skeptical of. It's like, oh yeah, they need more money. They need to build more stuff. They need more control over the internet too. They need to have more tools to combat Chinese subversion. And a lot of times it's just having more control over the internet and dictating more censorship of the internet. So I don't know. I think the right, it's very hard to counter this because the right, once again, there's some legitimate complaints. Is like TikTok does have, like a lot of social media in the internet, has some negative content, both from a political perspective and just in a social perspective. I think the right overstates it and pretends that depression among youth and leftism among youth is solely the creation of TikTok. No, it's not. It has more to do with our own institutions and our own leaders and what they're learning in school and demographics than it does with TikTok. But TikTok makes for a more convenient enemy, and it's better to see a foreign enemy as responsible for this rather than it coming from internal sources. And conservatives are just naturally anti-China, which I think is largely driven by good instincts, but it can be used and weaponized by people who do not have good intent to force the right to back woke American corporations and the deep state's interest, which we should not just blindly sign up for. So that's my thoughts on TikTok. We'll come back to K-Max questions. He's got a few more, at least one more. I want to answer this question about Dune because I saw Dune 2 this weekend, and controversially, I thought it was good. Jay asks, I also saw Dune 2 this weekend. It wasn't nearly as bad as Mr. Grove made it out to be. Mr. Grove's been complaining a lot about it. He just made a third podcast about how much he hated the movie, which I'm shocked by. I thought I was going to do his podcast on the movie, but I felt like I don't have enough material. I did a podcast back in 2021 on the first movie. If you want Dune content, go back to that. I've sometimes revisited content for IQ supplements, but it would be the same exact podcast if I did it. And he's saying, everyone is complaining about Zendaya, but she looks like a total loser at the end of the movie. She is literally pounding sand after Paul picks the cute white girl over her. I want to know the highly respected review. Yeah, that is, like I said, I thought it was good. I mean, it's not a great movie, but going into the theater, it's like entertaining. Some of it's like just like stupid. It's like, oh, there's like cool masses gathered making cool. There's like cool cinematography, cool visuals. There's lots of explosions. I don't know. It's just like an entertaining movie. And compared to a lot of other stuff that you were going to see out there, it's way better. It's way better than Marvel. It's way better than Star Wars. There's not really any woke content in there. I guess you're supposed to pretend Zendaya is good looking, but it's whatever. She gets owned in the end, as you say. And her character is completely different from how Chani is in the books, which Chani is just like totally submissive and enthralled with Paul Atreides. And in the movie, she's like, oh no, you know, she's like, I don't really trust you. I don't believe you're the Messiah. But you know, there's always those changes from books to movies. It's pretty faithful to the book. There's a few minor changes to it. I'm not the biggest fan of Dune, the books, because it creates an interesting world. There's an interesting plot, but it really, when you read it, it is like young adult fiction. Like the villains are just over the top villains. They don't really have understandable motivation for this rather than just to be evil, which is a lot like young adult fiction. The dialogue is really bad in the books. I still think they're interesting. I like the plots. I like the worlds that Frank Herbert created and many other things about it. But there are some downsides to it. But I thought it was a decent movie. And the one thing that I think that Wright has something to worry about is what, and I don't know if this is intentional, I think it's just how Hollywood has to have diversity roles, is that the movie does have the implication that all the, the Fremen in the movie are all non-white. I mean, Paul Atreides is obviously white and others, but everyone else in the Fremen are pretty much non-white. And there are also supposed to be Arab, blacks, and it really emphasizes the point that this is like they're like Muslims and they're the Ummah, and the Ummah also has a lot of non-whites in it, and it looks like if just the Arabs and blacks and all the other Muslims. I guess there's not really any Asians, Southeast Asians in there, but if all the, or really even South Asians, Pakistanis are in there, but if they had all united into one force and this was that, I mean, they're not saying jihad, they're saying holy war, because jihad means has certain implications in American society now, so they wanted to avoid that, understandably. So that is, and so all the people that are attacking the Harkonnen and the Sardaukar and all their leaders are white. The Sardaukar are entirely white, and they even look like very Vikings. A lot of them look like just special forces guys. They got the beards, they're very, very Nordic looking, and those are the bad guys. And the Harkonnen well, they're white. They don't have hair, but they're clearly like some form of white. But they're very bad white, and they're supposed to give off a Slavic uh, style with what they're about. And the tradies are white, but they're siding with the non-whites against the whites. And it's very similar to a white savior movie. And if you ever watch the stuff from Last Samurai to Dances with Wolves and other things, it's like the white guy joins up with the non-whites against the whites. And it's not a Hollywood invention because this is implied by the books. I mean, Frank Herbert based the Fremen on Arabs and Muslims. You know, they're using Arabic words or Arabic-like words. They're saying jihad. They have this fanatical religious belief in fundamentalists. You know, it's based on them. And there is an anti-colonialist mindset from that. But I think if you're watching it now, you know, that has a different implication, as you're just seeing non-whites good, whites bad. I don't think that's supposed to be intentional. I just think that's a natural result of what Hollywood is. But outside of that, even if you ignore that, but every movie conveys that, it's just not very obvious about it. And it's not I don't think it's its purpose to do so, but that is the implication from it. If you're just an outside observer watching the movie, you are seeing this as non-whites good, whites bad. And even with the Messiah prophecy, a lot of the Fremen are just saying this is meant to control us. This is our colonizers trying to feed us this bullshit. This is their propaganda to control us, to have their power, to have the whites still in charge of them. So there is that side effect of the movie, so to speak. But otherwise, I thought it was a decent movie. I was entertained. I will go see the third movie when it comes out. I had no real problems with it. It's not a great movie. I would not say it's like Lord of the Rings. I was not floored by it. I think it's hard for Hollywood to make those type of movies. The only movie I would have seen recently that would even fit that would be The Northman. That was just like floored by. I thought it was really good. But that's just the nature of Hollywood and our inferior quality of movies now. Now we'll finish up K-Mac's other question. He has just one more. He's, Scott, whenever you hear someone argue localism or that whites have no culture, they cannot behind you simply say all of American history and customs was white culture. This is what the woke have correct and conservatives have wrong. He made that as a question. It was framed in a different way as Washington, Jefferson, and Adams are viewed more in a colorblind way as having a universal view of how government should run and how the law should work. However, did any other race on earth have this same view of government and law? Africans, Asians, South Americans. It seems Washington and Jefferson's way was the white or European way. American culture is white culture. I would say, yeah, it's like when the woke say it's, you know, what's whiteness, and they just view history and customs and norms of America, you know, whether it's hard work, fair play, a real dedication to the rule of law, showing up to work on time, having these basic standards that we associate with just being a good middle class person in America, that's just white culture. Whites just don't acknowledge that, but the left does. And whenever they define whiteness, they generally go through what's standard American culture. And if you look at who's all made American culture and American traditions, it's largely been whites. So that would be always my question about that, is that the woke have it more correct and the conservatives have it wrong. There is that phrase, the woke are more correct, and this is one of the great examples of that. And I argued that in the 1776 discussion, which I'll guess I'll go off on a little bit about this. I thought it was a good discussion. If you guys didn't read it, we had a sequel to American Identity Debate. The first debate was just between Martyr Maid and I almost called him Jefferson Lee, Lafayette Lee, who essentially argued for localism and a greater sectionalism. I criticized it, saying this is unrealistic and white identity is more realistic than that. And then in the debate, I think I won, according to the responses. But you know, it was a good debate. It was civil. There were some issues later on. Martyr Maid claimed that I length cucked him, that we apparently had page limits or length limits on our responses. We did not, and that we had hard deadlines. We absolutely did not. We worked on this for a month. Some people maybe took a little bit longer than others, and then they were given as much time and space to deliver their answers, and they chose to deliver their answers in that format. But I thought it was a good debate. I think it does show why people choose local. The reason why people choose localism and sectionalism is because it's more politically correct. It's not, you're not going to get canceled for saying like we need Arkansas nationalism or something, or you need to be united with your neighbors more than white people in general. It's also something that even a lot of leftists and liberals argued before, because I've made this point before, but city identity is much more left-coded than it is right-coded. Because if you look at all these leftists, they're obsessed with whatever city they're living, whether it's New York, Boston, Minneapolis, Atlanta. You know, really strong city identity, which would be a form of localism, is extremely left-wing in America. Now, state identity is more right-wing or right-coded, depending on the state. Especially in the South. If like somebody's really proud to be, you know, a South Carolinian or a Georgian or a Tennessean, usually more right-wing or a more right-wing view. But for city identity, I know like a lot of right-wingers are like, you know, proud to come from somewhere like a city, but most right-wingers didn't grow up in a proper city. They grew up in the suburbs, or they grew up in a small town or a rural area. But the cities, that city identity is very much more of a left-wing thing. If you're very, and it could be not even the major cities. Like if you're really into being from Richmond, you're absolutely, Richmond, Virginia, you're absolutely a leftist. And that's like the truth throughout this country. And that's a form of localism. So and these people are very into like helping out the community and mainly ensuring homeless are not arrested and have ample drug supply. You know, if that they're practicing localism, and it's not very right wing. It's instead it's accelerating all these negative trends in our society. So I don't think it's and the kind of the base communities have it. You know, they generally don't have as strong of an identity as these large urban areas, which have a very strong culture, and it's generally left coded. And this is one point I didn't really make in the discussion, but it's something that has to come out, that if you're really thinking that you're wanting to create a base in red pill America, the fact that city identity, urban identity is so strongly linked with the left, and that all these city identities in America are left-coded, and sometimes very left-coded, I think that should make people reconsider their viewpoint on this. So that is a question that we have. And now we have a question from Tom. Tom said that this in a comment to the last IQ supplement, said the IQ supplement answered most of his questions. So I'll keep it brief. I'll still answer the question on the podcast because I just want to emphasize this. He says, question, he was going through, you know, all these media that he has. I'll just limit it to what his actual question is. Sorry, Tom. But he said, what would pro-white and nationalist art and entertainment look like in our modern anti-white culture? How important do you think it would be? Talent flocks to money, and even white conservatives have a knee-jerk reaction against white identity and actual nationalism. Americans need an HBO series about King Philip's War that portrays the settlers as the good guys, and a blockbuster thriller about Nemitz cleaning the streets of Las Vegas. That's really what it has to be, is just actual history that is portraying the whites as the good guys. And it could be anything from, well, Kevin Costner is having a new Western that's supposed to be at least multiple parts. I think at least 2 parts. It's coming out this summer, and it portrays the white settlers as the good guys in a vicious war with the Indians, which I think they portray the Indians as sympathetic. I mean, this is 2024, but they are. It's seen as the struggle against the Indians is settling the West and the frontier, and he's talked about in this in interviews. He's like, well, it's really bad, but it's how we settled the country, and we're going to portray the settlers' perspective. That's the type of right-wing art we need, and Costner is pretty liberal. He's very anti-Trump. He supported Liz Cheney. So maybe that would make him less liberal than the average Hollywood person, but he's not very right-wing. But this is the type of art and entertainment you would want. It would just be portraying history, whether it's King Philip's War or something else from the West or the frontier, and the white guys are the good guys. and you're sympathizing with them, and maybe it's in the Mexican-American War. Those are the bad guys, or something like the Alamo. That's really just what you need. You just need stories from American history or your Western history in general, like a pro-Columbus movie. I would even see something like The Northman, even though it's like all just white people. Even something like that, it's not trying to challenge the way that the Vikings were living at that time. It's an accurate portrayal of the Vikings and all the ugliness and barbarity and savagery, but it's not having a moral denunciation of it, or a moral signaling against it. It's just portraying it at what it is, and it made it very good art. So you don't really need a real deep message for it. You just need to uphold the myths that are important to American history, a true American identity, and a true Western identity in these movies. And you can see that in a lot of historical movies. So that would be the thing. It would be the real change. Instead of like a Columbus movie where Columbus is the villain and the Indians are the bad guys, instead that Columbus is obviously a hero and what he's doing is awesome. Or a movie about Cortez against the Aztecs, or Cortez is the good guy and the Aztecs are the bad guys. That's just like the simple stuff you need. I think even like Apocalypto, which doesn't really have the Spanish in it until the very end, that would be a right-wing movie because it's just showing how like horrible the Aztecs were. And it just has these traditional notions of just, honor and try to protect your family and fighting against cruel oppression. And I don't think anyone would just say this is like an obviously right-wing movie, but it just has right-wing things. Or even Braveheart, that's, even though that's only dealing with white people, I think it's still a very pro-nationalist message. And so that's all you really need. Obviously, the Lord of the Rings. I don't think they would make Lord of the Rings like they did today. And that's like the most unintentionally right-wing film series ever. And watching it now, it's like even extremely right-wing. And I don't think people at that time fully understood how right-wing it is, but it clearly is now. So we've got a lot of questions today. I think this is Dollar Bill. He's got 2 questions. During the last 2 GOP presidencies, the media created this narrative that the president was a mere puppet controlled by a sinister power behind the throne. In W's administration, there was either Dick Cheney or Karl Rove. When Trump was president, it was Steve Bannon or Vladimir Putin. I don't believe for a moment Biden is the one in charge of the administration. Who do you think it is? His wife Jill, Obama, or is it no single person but a coven of wine-guzzling millennial girl bosses in the administration? I think it's the coven. They had one guy that they always accused of being in charge, Ron Klain, who was the first chief of staff, but he's no longer in the administration. I think Joe Biden would probably, if you're going to put for an individual person, I would say Joe Biden. Jake Sullivan is very much in charge of foreign policy. He's the national security advisor. A lot of people complained about that. Whenever you see complaints about him in the media, it's coming from others in the administration, as he was the one who backed the Afghan withdrawal, and the Secretary of State and the Defense Department were not keen on this, but Jake Sullivan thought this is the best idea. There's just a lot of other, there's Democratic insiders who are the establishment. Like, I think Chuck Schumer has a lot of sway over what the administration does. Hakeem Jeffries probably has a lot of influence over what the administration does. I think Nancy Pelosi did when she was still leader of the Democratic Party and House Speaker. So it's just various groups of people. It's clearly not Joe in charge. But they don't really reveal it from the media. Ron Klain was one person that was blamed. Jake Sullivan's another. Jake Sullivan's still in the administration. I do think Jake Sullivan's entirely control of the foreign policy that the Biden administration makes. But outside of that, I wouldn't say it's millennial girl bosses. It's more elderly boomers who, just tell Biden what to do and he follows along. Sullivan's not a boomer. Sullivan is, yes, he is Generation X. I was wondering if he might be a millennial, but he is Generation X. And so that's who is most influential in the Biden administration. And his second question, please consider doing an IQ supplement on the book Intellectuals by Paul Johnson. It's a collection of short pieces on the lives of intellectuals, starting from Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 1700s to 19th century figures like Karl Marx and Tolstoy, to 20th century writers like Ernest Hemingway, Bertolt Brecht, and Jean-Paul Sartre. A common theme of the book is how these figures claim to love humanity in the abstract, but were frequently awful to the people around them, with Johnson describing how these intellectuals would never pay back money, borrow from friends and family, indulge in alcoholism, cheat on their wives, ignore their children they sired out of wedlock, and defend communist Russia and its purges. It's one of my favorite books. I like Paul Johnson's works. I've read a few of them, so I probably would read that. It definitely sounds like an attack on leftists. So conservatives love his stuff. I remember when I worked at our intern at Leadership Institute years ago, they always recommended Modern Times as like by Paul Johnson as like a must-read book. As unlike a lot of other conservatives, I think he's worth reading. So maybe I would do something on that book. That's a pretty good suggestion. Now we've got John Chandler. We've still got a lot of questions, so if there's people out there who are wondering where there's questions, we're still getting to them. He says, curious to hear your thoughts on Haiti and where you think the situation there might lead. I remember being fascinated a decade ago when Amron did a review of the British writer and explorer Hesketh Pritchard's book, Where Black Rules White, where Black Rules White, about his travels through the interior of Haiti nearly a century after the island's revolution. Is Haiti, in all our history and tragedy, a major red pill? Do you think there is a risk of a Campos Saint-style exodus to the shores of Florida? Very curious to hear your thoughts about it. Haiti's always been a shithole. It's always going to be a shithole. In a real world, we would have like a permanent occupation force there to ensure that there's some stable government. Now, I know a lot of people don't like interventions and stuff, but we've intervened in Haiti all throughout its history. And it was just, we were there to stabilize the government, so they're all not just fleeing into America. The real problem with this latest thing, I mean, it's always going to be this way. You just need to make sure that it's stable enough that they're all not trying to flee to America. And that's really what you want. And that's one of the good things about El Salvador and Bukele. It's like people are like, oh, we can have the Bukele model here, probably not through the way America is. But what Bukele is good is that it establishes a strong authoritarian government that cracks down on crime and creates stability, so they're not all trying to get to America. And if more of Latin America and Caribbean was like that, we would not have the immigration problems we have. So there's definitely a huge risk of Campos States. We've already been having a ton of Haitians come to the United States, the border. I think they're second to Venezuelans in the number of migrants coming here. I mean, they are part of the parole program that Biden had, which is 4 countries: is Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti. And so they're one of the major groups coming up there to the United States through illegal immigration. And now pretty much even more of them are going to come. So we're absolutely going to have a terrible situation with the Haitians. This is going to be like this throughout history. It's always been like this. We've always had to send in troops there. I mean, Bill Clinton had to send in troops there. Woodrow Wilson sent in troops there. We've always sent in troops to Haiti. I don't really think it's maybe the best idea now because we don't even have someone to back up. So hopefully they figure out somebody like a strong-arm leader. Maybe it is Barbecue, the gang leader, who can establish order there, and we just back him. But it is a major red pill. If you ever want to learn about our beliefs, just study the history of Haiti. And they'll always be like, oh, this is because the French imposed punitive financial costs on them for the revolution. It's like, they murdered every white Frenchman there. It's like, what are they supposed to do? Welcome them into the global economy? Even if they had welcomed them into the global economy, it'd still be a shithole. And they'd find a new way to blame America for this. So Trump was right when he described Haiti as one of these shithole countries way back in 2018. And it's always going to be that way. It's always going to be a major red pill for people to look. And I think the news stories about it and what's happening there, I think opens a lot of American eyes to, people are fundamentally different from us. It's not everyone is born the same. It's born as a blank slate at birth. There are countries that are just bound to always be like this. And this is always going to be the history of Haiti. So that is my question to that. I think we'll go on to future American refugee. We still, once again, don't worry, we've still got a lot of people to go through. Future American refugee has 2 questions. He has on 2 different subjects. You recently stated that Trump will win if he's not criminally convicted before the election. I am inclined to agree with you for a number of reasons, but I am hesitant because I have serious concerns what we will see, that we will see the same massive fraud of 2020 in the big cities of swing states like Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, etc. I'm very concerned there will be a massive mail-in ballot fraud that will be used in conjunction with the method of stopping the count until tomorrow, repeatedly until Trump's lead is no longer in that respective state. Do you not share this concern? Do you believe election fraud will not be an issue? Please share your thoughts on why you think Trump will be a lock and why fraud will not be able to overcome his margins in the swing states. No, I definitely have that concern about what could these rules that they've passed, especially in a state like Pennsylvania. They have very loose mail-in ballot rules, which allows the left to do ballot harvesting to their heart's content. That is a major problem in a very certain states. But in Georgia, they largely restricted it. Those election reforms that they did in 2021, that the MLB and all these other companies were threatening to boycott Georgia over, has mostly restricted that problem. And they still, Herschel Walker would have won in that state if he had not paid for his lover's abortions. So he would have still won. And even with these problems, Republicans can still win statewide in a lot of these states. Ron Johnson won in Wisconsin, and he was one of the main guys that was pushing Stop the Steal in the Senate. He still won in Wisconsin, and they have a Republican supermajority there in their legislature. They can still win in Arizona. They can still win in Nevada. They elected a Republican governor in 2022. I do think it makes it harder, but it's still possible. I don't really like to... These are issues we need to solve. I think it does make Pennsylvania a lot harder, but there's a solution to this. Just have election reforms where you restrict the mail-in ballot, where you emphasize voter ID and all these other measures. That can reduce this advantage for the Democrats. It's not all completely hopeless. And I think it's worth being aware of, but I don't like this. It's very much self-defeating to be that, this election, it looks like he's going to win, but they're going to steal it anyway. It's like, look, we need to hype ourselves up with a positive attitude that Trump is going to win. Even with all their mail-in ballot rules and all this stuff that they're going to throw at Trump, we're still going to win. And we need that positive attitude, because if you're proposing and constantly posting about how they're going to steal the election, that deflates our vote total. And this has happened several times, that a lot of these people were like, well, I would vote for Trump, but my vote's going to be stolen anyway. It's like, look, we need you to vote, okay? They're going to make it easier us proposing this idea and saying it's going to be a fraud and stolen, no matter what, is a way of discouraging our own people from voting, and makes it even more likely the Democrats are going to rig it again. So I'm not very much into it. I think it's a very pessimistic look at it. You need to hype yourselves up. We're going to win anyway. It doesn't matter with how many mail-in ballots they have. We're going to win no matter what. I do think there are certain states where the rules are bad that it makes it harder for Republicans to win. As I said, I keep saying Pennsylvania, but in Georgia we should win because they've changed the rules. They've made it harder for them to ballot harvest in Georgia. We won statewide in Wisconsin in 2022. We won statewide in Nevada in 2022. We nearly won statewide in Arizona. Now, there was trickery there too. But I still think we could overcome that. And so we need this idea that, yes, Democrats are going to throw some tricks in our way and do some shenanigans, but we're still going to overcome that, because there's going to be such an overwhelming support for Trump in November that they can't steal the election. They can't rig it. So I think that's the mentality we need, rather than indulging in a little bit too much of a self-defeatist attitude. That would be my view on it. I do take it seriously, but I think as what we're trying to do with propaganda, I think it's better to say we're going to win anyway. And I think we will. And so I am confident about that. Two, there have been some Twitter controversy about walkability in communities and as it pertains specifically to the South. Having lived in the South my entire life, I have to say you couldn't be more correct in your assessment that the South revolves around driving cars for transportation. The large majority of people you see walking for transport in the South are magicians and South Central American individuals with low to no income. I'm personally very happy that I live far from walking individuals in urban areas and that I can keep my family away from all that by living in the suburbs and using a car whenever we need to go anywhere or do anything. I understand that rush hour traffic can be a drag, but from our perspective, it beats walking next to the most dangerous and disorderly individuals in society as a means of getting around town. What do you think drives this walkability movement? Why is it that many people who are inclined to side with us politically seem to forget who the people that walk for transportation are and why we don't want to be walking on the same sidewalk as them to get to a store or go to work? Also, do you envision a possibility of future suburban developments that have good demographics and are located within a small enough proximity that the residents would walk for most of their transportation? Or is any such development destined to be plagued and destroyed by low-income apartment housing that the city commissioners and our state government impose on it? I have a lot of thoughts on this. The people who were arguing that the South has a lot of walkability are nuts. That is completely fake news. They're like, people walk. I see people walking their dogs. That is the only walkability in the South. Nobody walks in the South, and they've never walked in the South. I was talking with, Eric Cutan and some others. It's like the South has always been dictated by people living by far away distances that they've had to use horses or whatever means of transportation to get anywhere. They rarely have walked because far away distances has always been rural. It's something that's just been a part of the culture. But it also have to say is like the South didn't really have major cities up until after World War II. After the development of air conditioning and that more companies were coming around here. And they were all built with the automobile in mind. Now, some cities, there was a little bit more walkability than others if they had been historically a city much longer, like Charleston, New Orleans, a few other places. But pretty much every other city was built with an automobile in mind. This is very different from northern cities, which had a lot of development and before the automobile took over and the highway took over. Our southern cities were made for the highway. And a lot of this is due to the demographics of who walks around. You do have in the South that there are all these wandering magic Americans in the middle of the day. You don't know where they're wandering to. They follow no rules of the road. They're jaywalking at all hours, and they just walk around. And that's generally, if you're walking in a southern city, that's who you see who's walking around. Now, there's some exceptions. I mean, Nashville now has a lot of walkers and some of the other more developing cities. But in general, I've lived in, mid-sized cities or gone to mid-sized cities like Richmond, Chattanooga, and Knoxville. Generally, the people walking around are, as he says, are magicians and South Central American individuals. And most people just drive everywhere. Now, there's the understandable aspect of that, due to the South's demographics, that we have to drive everywhere. You live out in the nice suburbs, and the suburbs are spread apart, and it's a long part of Southern culture and Southern ways is that people just drive everywhere. And, usually you don't live near a grocery store that is within walking distance. And we don't build communities in a way that there's an easily accessible sidewalk to that grocery store. You have to cross like some really heavily trafficked roads and other things to sidewalks. I remember when I was growing up, if I ever wanted to walk anywhere, sometimes I like walking places. There might be a little bit of magical behavior, but I like walkability. I much prefer walking somewhere than driving somewhere. It's much more relaxing, get exercise, get out in the sun. I like it. But in the South, it's very hard because there'd be like no sidewalks going somewhere. You'd have to cross a road, which doesn't even have like the pedestrian signs. And that's just the way the South is. And usually you live far away enough from a grocery store. But there are problems with it because even when I was in college, my friends would never drive anywhere or would never walk anywhere. One time I was going to go out to get beer at a gas station near an apartment I lived at, and my roommate looked like I was crazy that I was going to walk there. And it's at max 5-minute walk. It was right next to the apartment complex area. It was not a far walk at all. But he looked at me like I was crazy. And I remember whenever I lived in my fraternity house, I was like the only guy who would walk to school. It was a bit of a distance walking from the fraternity house, and also you had to go through some very magical areas. I always made sure I got like pledges to driving back to the house, but I would walk there. I would walk there in the morning, when the magic was asleep, but nobody really walked, and that's just how it is throughout the South. So I don't know where these guys are coming from. It's like people are like, people walk their dogs all the time. It's like people do not walk to places. That's the difference, is that generally when people think of walkability, they're not thinking you can walk your dog or have your stroller in your neighborhood. They're thinking you can walk to places. You can walk to the grocery store. You can walk to restaurants. The South is not built that way. Nobody in the South thinks about walking to places. And when you say you're about to walk to a place that's like 5 to 10 minutes away, they look at you like you're nuts. And that's just the way it is. Now, and as I said, to agree with the questioner, to agree with Future American Refugee, it's just the nature of the thing. You want to avoid these situations. If you're, like I said, if I was walking back to my fraternity house at night, crossing into magical territory, that wasn't the smartest decision. So that's why it would be better to drive at that moment. And so the demographics of the South make it for the driving. And whenever people complain that the automobile ruined cities, that's like, I think you're looking at the wrong suspect, the wrong cause. The reason why the automobiles and highways developed is because after the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Revolution, people could not live in the cities the way they could before, and they retreated to the suburbs to have a nice community for their children. And now they will drive, have this commute and long commute and all these things that they would deal with. So if the future of suburban developments, good demographics, I would think it's better to have small enough proximity that you can walk to the grocery store, walk to restaurants, and walk to other places like that, and to develop in those structures in there. But if you are going to have low-income apartment housing, which the Democrats are trying to force on to suburbs, you would prefer to have this built for highways and driving, so you prevent them from getting to your areas. And it's even like this with DC. And so Georgetown doesn't have a metro stop, and it's very hard to walk to. And the very nice parts of DC are very hard to get to if you don't have a car. And they've intentionally made it that way to keep out the magic. So I understand why it happens. But, when you compare it to a nice area where you can walk everywhere, especially with Europe, in Europe, they're like, I can walk everywhere. It's so nice. Everything's there. It's like, you're able to do that because of the demographic differences. And the demographic differences in the South prevent that. It's also the South doesn't have public transportation, has horrible public transportation, and due to part to keep out the magic from the nice areas. So you absolutely do need a car in the South. And I don't know why people are just upset by the obviousness of that. So that's my answer to that question. We still have a lot more questions. Let's see. Who will we go next? We've got one who wants to call himself listener. He's a new Convolute member. Our new questioner, so we'll ask his question. He said, if someone has reasonably valuable skill set, think tech, media, legal, etc., along with the ability to organize, how would you recommend them getting involved in conservative political causes on a part-time basis? It seems like the most conservative nonprofits are one of the following: Con Inc., Chamber of Commerce, Grifts, local causes which largely need grassroots door knocking and cold calling. While I can respect these political causes, it does seem like the blind leading the blind, organizations which I may agree with, but may make someone unemployable within wider society, AFPAC, Ameren, etc. Any thoughts on first steps? At a higher level, I do think this is one area where conservatives are at a distinct institutional disadvantage. For example, a law partner can assist with a myriad of nonprofits which are anti-white and everything but name only, but for a conservative, it seems like there are fewer ways to get meaningfully involved unless they're willing to go full send. I also suspect the desire to send more white males to plumbing school won't help with this. And that's the answer. That's a little bit difficult. It depends on how, with legal is very easy to get involved with because we do need more lawyers involved in this stuff. You do need lawyers defending free speech and censorship. You do need lawyers to attack DEI policies and anti-white hiring policies. There's a lot of need for right-wing lawyers. The problem is that he points out is that it can hurt your career to get involved in some of this stuff, but it's very easy for conservative lawyers to get involved in this. Even the Republican Party apparatus needs lawyers to help them to file suits against like mail-in ballot initiatives or loose voting policies. You need lawyers for that. So it's there's a lot of ways for lawyers to get involved. Tech, there's some alt tech platforms that they can get involved in that need help. I think that they probably want to be monetarily compensated for that because of the amount of work they're going to put into. But there needs to be alternatives to Stripe and other things that can be developed. Media, that's easy. You could do podcasting and writing. You can even do that under a pseudonym. Some of the stuff can even be done under a pseudonym that you can have. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for this. And even with some of the local causes, I do think taking over a major city young Republican group, even if that major city, like, Republicans don't have any opportunity in winning, it's still useful. What New York young Republicans and out of the DC young Republicans are doing is very impactful, and they're having interesting speakers come there. They're inviting people that have otherwise been ostracized or purged from conservatism to get involved. And if you control that group, you have an impact on your local party and your state party. Because even if, like, say, Republicans aren't competing in Nashville, the state Republican Party is still going to take its local Nashville Republicans seriously. They're going to go and meet with them. And those guys that they talk to, they can have an influence on the local lawmakers and others. So I think, door knocking, cold calling, I think when it comes to a presidential campaign and you live in a battleground state like Arizona, Pennsylvania, even some place like Virginia, I don't think Republicans are going to win in 2024. But one of the ones that you could win, even that is important because we do need competent volunteers to do that type of stuff. And actually the Republican infrastructure on that, the get out the vote campaigns and related measures, is lacking compared to Democrats. So there's a lot of ways to get involved. It depends on lawyers, but specifically using their skills, lawyers, absolutely, there's tons and tons of ways. I just think conservatives need to build up that infrastructure for lawyers in the same way the left has. I mean, the left, like Antifa, immediately has legal defense for their guys when they get arrested. And it'd be great if conservatives had that for our own side. And it's up to conservatives to build up that infrastructure so it attracts the high talent people to volunteer and to not jeopardize their careers when they get involved in that stuff. So that would be my answer to that. We will take the next question from Paul. We still got more questions. We are getting so many questions from Cognitive Elite. He says, "Hi Scott, I've got 2 questions and sorry for the first one's length. You've long maintained that we need to form a counter elite, mostly focused on things like corporate jobs or lawyers. To what degree do you think the right should pursue jobs and institutions that shape people's political, cultural views?" I think a lot of people's views are shaped more by osmosis than by actively consuming what is perceived as explicitly political messaging. For example, how much damage has the civil rights movement mythology in K-12 classes done for the average American views on race? How many college-educated whites vote Democrat because they saw a headline or a story from the legacy media about a race hoax or bullshit Trump scandal? How many young people's political views are influenced by numerous movies and video games with racist or right-coded villains, as you noted in the past? How many people... And so he goes along with it. I'll try to get to... Well, it'd be nice to get these people to look at right-wing content. Realistically, a lot of these people will almost never spend any time looking at media they perceive as having explicit political views and get most of their core views from cultural osmosis and vibes. I think this is even more textbook for K-12, as I hear an AP US history textbook being prepared will present January 6th as an insurrection. To what extent should right-wingers try to become K-12 educators, work at the conservative legacy news organizations like NBC, CBS, etc., and work in film and TV stuff? And by film and TV, I mean Hollywood, not Daily Wire type stuff. Most likely, they would not be able to explicitly push right-wing views in these positions, but they could use whatever power they have at these companies and institutions to make sure as little left-wing views as possible are propagated, or quietly make sure that whatever possible that the most zealous leftist activists aren't hired at these companies. Do you think we can, or should we do this, or do we not have enough people with its skills and interests in these professions to make it work? Especially to hide their views, or is it not worth it as some suggest that for the younger generations, legacy news and entertainment institutions will have a lot less influence as social media independent content creators make up most of their media consumption? He's got another question, so we'll go to that next. I think there's a difference. I think we should have more right-wingers go into K-12 education. It is not well-paying, and it's also very feminine, but you're more likely to influence people's views and get into less trouble by sharing right-wing views or presenting a right-wing take on history than you are as a college professor, and it's easier to get into than academia. I think we do need more people doing that, because generally what we have is that the dumbest people take major in like secondary education in college. It's always the case. Like the dumbest people are in that, and then they become teachers. It's a very unfortunate matter. If we had more people going into teaching and getting the credentials and pushing for that, you could have a real impact on people. Imagine if you're like an English AP teacher and you're introducing these ideas and writers to people that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I had my AP classes, I think, had a major impact on me when I was looking at the world. I don't know if they made me right wing, but I think those teachers do have an influence on you when you're 15 or 16. And if that person's really inspiring and they're considered right wing, and or they're introducing works to young people that they wouldn't otherwise never know of, I think that can have a major impact. So I support definitely more people going into teaching than as what other people suggest. I know doesn't make the best money, but it does have a lot of job security, does have great benefits, usually has great benefits and a nice pension. Maybe you might need to marry a wealthy woman to have this, or if you're a woman, you should absolutely consider becoming a teacher. And you have our political beliefs. We don't have very many women who listen to this podcast, or if they're women, they are, I think, a little bit too old to do a job change. But I think it's popular. Now, when it comes to legacy media entertainment, I think that's a lot harder to get into. Hollywood in general, no matter your political beliefs, is insanely difficult to get into. And even the legacy media, news media, is very tough. It's not as tough as Hollywood. I think it's better with independent content creation. Now, I can give very good examples with this one, legacy media, because conservative media operated in the 2010s on this assumption that they're training the next generation of mainstream media journalists. And when these guys who worked at the Daily Caller or Washington Free Beacon, Breitbart didn't really have this mentality, but all the others like The Blaze, they all had this mentality that they're training the next generation of mainstream media journalists. And when these guys get in there, they're going to make the mainstream media more conservative. That has always turned out bullshit. All these guys get jobs in mainstream media and then they become libtards. Look at Caitlin Collins. Look at John Carl, who's another guy. He was considered conservative or fairly conservative during the Obama years, but then he became extremely liberal. Every reporter I know of who went into mainstream media then became a liberal. Straight up liberal, no conservative views at all. There's a really good example of Tim Alberta, who we both got a Novak Fellowship, which was supposed to, give you money to write a book, and was given to the top conservative media talent. I lost mine because I got doxxed at that time, but Tim Alberta was in that class, and he was seen as the next great conservative journalist. He moved on to the mainstream media, and now he's even saying that it's unchristian for conservatives to want to restrict abortion. And so he's even ditched the one view that the left will allow him to have, to be pro-life. And so now he just writes articles attacking conservatives as fascists and other things. There's nothing conservative about him. He has no influence. All it does is that it influences, they will sell out to their career. Now, I think with Hollywood, there are right-wing people there and they don't just totally sell out. But when it comes to news media, they completely sell out. Completely sell out because they know that's what their career depends on. They're not going to write, even for something that's safer like abortion, they're not going to write pro-life articles. They're not going to cover it in a sympathetic manner to pro-lifers. They're just going to use their connections to better attack and denounce conservatives and the right than that. So it's better to build independent, your own institutions when it comes to media. And also, they're in rapid decline. Mainstream media is having mass layoffs. It's not going to be like how it was in the 2010s. It's better to build up your own institutions and your legacy media, thanks to social media and other things, and work from there. Now, sometimes like New York Times and Washington Post and CNN, the major print media, which is now just like Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post. I would even argue it's maybe just New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal still portrays things from a right-wing perspective, but that's because the editorial team and the ownership is right-leaning, not because of the people around it. If you want to have an impact on legacy media, you need a conservative to buy it up, or a right-wing person to buy it up. You're not going to make an impact as a journalist, as a low-level journalist from there. You're going to just join the team and become a liberal yourself. I think that's the same with Hollywood. I think you just need right-wing people to fund serious, big-budget films and maybe work within the Hollywood infrastructure to do that. And the low-level people will make, an unintentionally right-wing movie for that. But you do need the talent for that. I don't know if we have enough talented people for Hollywood yet. I know there are some creative people that are involved in this stuff, but you don't have enough people to fully replace Hollywood. So that's that. Now for his second question. As you mentioned in the last episode, prior to the 21st century, there was a huge percentage of the white electorate that could go either way. Why do you think that political demographic is nearly gone? Is it because the two parties are more formally tied to having certain political and cultural positions than in the past, or something else? If it's the first, why are they more tied to those positions than before? How many college-educated whites? I think. Hold on. I think this question got repeated. If it's the first, then why are they more tied to those positions than before? Oh, yeah. I think he sent it in a weird way. He sent it through direct message. So that's why I got it a little copied. So that's the whole question. It's like, why are more firmly tied to certain political, cultural positions in the past? I think it is because they are, Democrats and Republicans, or more ideologically aligned as a party, or who's in the party, than the past, especially in this, there were still very liberal Republicans in the 80s. And there were most of them left over Reagan, but they were still there. And there were still very conservative Democrats into the 90s and 2000s. I wouldn't say many. There was many in the 90s. There were not that many in the 2000s. They were still there. But since the 2010s, there are very few liberal Republicans. Even the rhinos are much more conservative than the rhinos of the 80s. I think the only two people who are truly liberal Republicans are Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. You have some ones that you wish they would vote better, but pretty much every Republican now has to be anti-abortion. Pretty much every Republican has to be pro-Second Amendment. They can't really support amnesty. There's still a few, but it's overwhelmingly the party's more aligned on these views, and they're more socially conservative than they would have been in the 80s and 90s. And still into the 2000s, you had Republicans who were pro-choice. You don't have any Republicans who are pro-choice anymore. And so they're just more ideologically aligned than before. And I think it's also that American people, white Americans, have become much more politically polarized on these issues. And it's there's less of an independent bloc than there was in years past. I think it's because there's been a sorting where people have moved to areas that are red. If they're conservative, if they're blue, they've moved to liberal areas. It's more that if they're conservatives, they've just left blue states, especially after 2020. But it's been happening for a long time before then. I think there was a shared consensus before. We go back to the Cold War. Democrats were pretty anti-communist. Republicans were pretty anti-communist. You would have seen a wide diversity of foreign policy views within the parties. But the general consensus is that they wanted to be stronger, harder against the communists. most of them, you had a lot of Democrats that who were very pro free market, are low, wanting to spur policies that were pro business and other things, like Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter actually wanted to reduce government spending in other ways and promote more free market economics, which we've seen as a Republican idea, and so did Bill Clinton. But today, I think everyone's pretty rigid and stuck in their views. And it's somewhat of a cultural thing. And I think it's maybe the development of more partisan media. Partisan media was very much a part of American life in the 19th century. It had a decline in the 20th century, but now we have much more partisan media. And so people get a lot of their news from a certain place, and they're already committed to either Republican or Democrat. And so the political polarization that you've had, along with the parties becoming much more ideologically aligned within themselves, has made it to where they can't have these overwhelming majorities that they had in the past. Like Obama's 2008 victory was probably the last we would have seen of such a massive victory of that scale. It's now just going to be at the margins of how big of a majority they can get in Congress, and it'll be a very thin margin of victory for a Democrat or a Republican to win in a presidential election. And that's just the way America is going to be for the foreseeable future. We have 2 more questions. If you asked a question, we've had a lot today. Please remind me. We're getting so many questions. I'm drowning on all the great questions we're having, which is a good problem. It's not even really a problem, but I just have to say it's... sometimes these things can get lost in the mix. So second to last question is from Mystery. Hey Scott, IQ question. A lot of the great foundational and keyed history books of the 19th and early 20th century have gone down the memory hole. And typically when I went to dive deeper on a subject, I get Google results for books written in the 90s at best. You were the first place I'd heard of the Dunning School, for example. Do you have any suggestions for a resource or reference that will get these classic authors and works on my radar? I would have to write an article or do an IQ supplement on that. So I'll have to return to Mystery, because there are so many works that you'd have to list that are foundational for it, and a lot of it's just forgotten about. So I'd have to do a list on that, on specific subjects on people to learn. Primarily I'll do one on American history. I've got to get around to doing that. It'll probably be an article, so I can spread this to the entire world of my beliefs on what are some things. But yes, it's very hard to find this stuff, and looking up, and you'll get results for 90s and 2000s books. But there's some books that unintentionally recent that will portray an identitarian view of American history. They'll be negative about it, but they'll still present it no matter what. So we now have going to New England Refugee. We always like to leave on New England Refugee. He actually has a funny question. He said, thoughts on the ICP Insane Clown Party story of the week. Macron's wife is actually a man. Candace Owens staked her professional career on it. I don't think she should stake her professional career on it. It is very loopy. We do have this idea that I had a funny tweet where it's like, all my opponents are homosexual men married to biological males, which would apply to Obama and Macron. I have no earthly idea where the Brigitte Macron is a man came from. She doesn't look or resemble a man, even from her old pics. I'm going to be accused of being a cuck here, but I don't think Michelle Obama is a man. I think she's a woman. But the jokes are there because she's very muscular and a big woman, and it's just funny. The thing is I think these things begin as jokes, but then they're taken seriously, and I'm a bit of a truth cuck. I like to be truth and facts. I do appreciate memes, but I think that one problem with memes and jokes is that they eventually become to be believed, and then their point of orthodoxy that you have to believe this stuff. And I think Brigitte Macron is kind of the natter of that, of what it is. It's that I don't know why this would be an important topic for American media to cross, and French media has been all over it. They're now getting to understand the ICP of American conservatism with this. I still think Candace Owens is good. I think she just goes on like 4chan a little bit too much and gets convinced by this stuff. And like the websites she was relying on are like look like they were made in the mid-90s. So I think they look like they were made when Emmanuel Macron was still in high school, or the French equivalent of it. So I don't understand why people want to stake their reputation on this or be into Brigitte Macron as a man. I mean, Macron's wife has kids that look exactly like her. So, and her husband, she has a husband. I think and she left her husband to marry Macron. I think the husband would be so livid at that idea that, or over that he would have been like, she's a man. I don't know how she has a daughter that looks exactly like her. I don't know how this story plays out. The funniest thing is that Emmanuel Macron publicly reacted towards it, which is makes it even funnier. That would be the same if Michelle Obama ever ran for president. We would have a whole national story over how Michelle Obama was not Michael Obama. I think this stuff is like funny for memes. I don't think you should take them seriously, and I think it's not wise for Candace Owens to stake her reputation on it when you can clearly look at her daughters and see that they're clearly hers. I guess with Michelle, even with Michelle Obama's like kids, the youngest looks exactly like her, and the oldest looks like a Barack. So I don't know. Whatever. It shouldn't be taken too seriously. Like that's all. When it's all on the level of just like shit posters and anons posting it, it's fine. But when it reaches the level of conservative commentators and they're being very serious about it and staking the reputation on it, that's a little bit much. And that really creates the impression that the American right is incredibly clownish and is not dedicated to anything serious. And as you guys know, I'm very much opposed to that happening or that taking hold. So that is it for Highly Respected today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It's all kind of like questions, and it was a long podcast. So we're going to have more great content in the future. We'll have a great podcast later this week and at least one article. We might have 2 articles this week. No promises, but be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.